Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Penn. I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner and one of the co-founders of Open Nurses. After that swelling introduction to music, I would love to tell you about our evening's guest, Dr. Megan, or Meg Miller, who has been a registered nurse since 2015, gaining experience in hospice and palliative care, nursing education, and health promotion across the lifespan. Their work focuses on supporting holistic, compassionate, and equitable palliative care. Meg is currently an assistant professor in the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Nursing and an executive committee member in the UW-Madison Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances. She completed her BSN and PhD programs at Michigan State University with a focus on cancer symptom management and integrative therapies, later transitioning into a postdoctoral research fellowship at UW-Madison to further explore spirituality and psychedelic-assisted therapy, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot tonight. Their mixed methods research examines the role of spirituality in supporting management of common serious illness-related symptoms and explores psilocybin-assisted therapy as a supportive care intervention among people with serious illness who have been underrepresented in research. Meg is a creator of the Creative Dying Conversation game, a Death Café facilitator, which is, I think, how we first met, and is a graduate of the California Institute of Integral Studies Certificate in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies and Research Program. They are passionate about examining applications of psychedelic-assisted therapy for facing illness, death, and grief, as well as exploring equitable community-based models for palliative and end-of-life care. So let me invite Meg onto the screen here. Hey, Meg. Good to
Hi,
see you.
thank you.
That's,
I know I wrote that, but it's exciting to hear it read back, so
I
thanks.
know. It's so funny. It's a little known secret of bios is that, you write them as if like they're being written by another person and then somebody has to read them. And then you hear yourself talked about in third person. It's rather disorienting. But yeah, hey, welcome. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
Yeah. We have a few people watching live, and so for the folks that are watching live, feel free to pop in the chat. Let us know where you're coming to us from and what your interests are, and as we go forward, feel free to populate the chat with questions, which we will get to at the end of our the tail end of our conversation. So, Meg, we always sort of start these conversations off similarly, which is really kind of how'd you get here? What's your part in all of this, and what are you interested in?
Yeah, so let's see. So I started with a curiosity or an interest around death and dying, and that began through a early experience when I was young with facing a loved one's death.
Mhm.
And I got really interested in like where did they go? What happened here? And my mom's amazing. And we went to the library and we got a ton of books about like different spiritual perspectives and views of the afterlife and before life. And what does that mean or look like in different traditions? And I remember cuddling in together in her bed and reading these and getting so curious about
Mhm.
these big questions. And so I went to nursing school, and in there, I was thinking, like, I want to care for babies or care for folks at the end of life, like
Mhm.
those portals. Curiosity continues. And once I actually got into practice, I got very interested in end of life care. And mostly my nursing work was in oncology. And
Mhm.
so when I went to grad school, I was doing some work around nursing research with meditative practices. And I was blown away by nursing research. Like, wait, we can ask questions that can influence practice. That's so fantastic. And so I was specifically interested in like, again, these big questions around like, how are folks making meaning about their dying experience and their grief experience? How can we support folks when they're facing death? And I felt like there wasn't as many options as I wanted to be able to offer. And I guess personally to have, because I'm also facing death in some forms. So I was gifted the book Psychedelic Healing by Neil Goldsmith, I believe, during
Mhm.
my PhD nursing program by a loved one. And I remember just like tearing through it. I was so excited. I was highlighting, I was sticky noting. thinking like, wait, this is something we can offer. And I brought
Mm.
it to my advisors. I printed out a bunch of articles to show them. And there was support, but it was kind of like, okay, we'll put this over here and like, let's finish your dissertation, which is totally understandable. They really, I think, helped me intentionally set things up so that I could incorporate work with psychedelics down the road. So my focus was on spirituality and spiritual care, and still is in my research today. But that really launched my interest. I remember learning about the CIIS, Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy and Research Training Program, and I was in grad school and I had no money and no time, but I remember downloading everything and being like, "Oh, I wanna do this." So, I was super fortunate that during my postdoc, I got to be a part of, that training program and to expand my work with psychedelics. So, I'm dabbling in research in that area now, and as you know, we have a couple collaborations
Mhm.
burning. So, that's kind of the overall of what brought me here.
That's fantastic. So, I mean, we get a lot of nurses reaching out to us, us being open nurses, saying, maybe I'm thinking about going back to school, or I'm thinking, I want to somehow incorporate psychedelics into my practice, but I don't really know how.
Mhm.
I don't know where to start. And it sounds like you had kind of a similar experience, like you had this inspiration from that book and from the things you were exposed to when you were much younger, and then kind of taking that to your advisor, and then being a little bit, I don't want to say off-putting, but maybe a little lukewarm on the idea. um, but then it sounds like you kind of built a foundation that you could then
Mhm.
sort of build psychedelics on top of. Is that fair
Yes.
to say?
I agree, and I think I got what I have perceived as pretty good advice in terms of, like, don't necessarily center everything, and this is for me personally, don't necessarily center everything on psychedelics because this field is fickle, as we recently saw. And so the core for me is palliative care and supporting spirituality. And then through that, psychedelics are one route, I believe, that can be supportive. But I also do work more broadly with spirituality. And some mentors and advisors have suggested that despite my like full force ahead on only centering psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy, but I kind of have these parallel tracks that are definitely interrelated.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of a layer cake. You're a nurse first. You're a palliative care nurse, specialty on top of that, with spirituality as a focus, because there's lots of different tracks in palliative care, right? I mean, you could be into symptom management, or you know ostomy management or something like that, and then so spirituality and then psychedelics are as the cherry on top.
Yeah, a nice layer of
Yeah,
frosting.
yeah. But you kind of went past it quickly, but I think it's worth underscoring what you said about how a lot of people are sort of starting with this idea of like, I want to be a psychedelic therapist. We don't even know exactly what that is yet, right? Or I want to be a psychedelic nurse. Like, I don't know, do you know what that is yet? I'm not sure I know yet.
Yeah. Yes, and I love that we all bring such incredible, unique backgrounds and skills. Like, I know some psychedelic nurses who work in the space of eating disorders or
Mm,
PTSD, and definitely interrelationships between these things, but I really believe there's space for all of us and our unique expertise in this field.
yeah, yeah. So
Mm,
so you're in kind of a small group, which is nurses who went on to get PhDs.
mm, yeah.
So I mean, and I remember when I was, in nursing school, like academic nursing seemed really kind of obscure, to be totally honest, like a little inaccessible. I'd read my nursing theory book and be like, I don't know what they're talking about. It seemed to make more sense later, actually, but when I was a student, it was kind of hard to follow.
Mhm.
Um, could you talk about your decision to go back to get a PhD, and what is that? What was that like, and what
Mhm.
value has that brought to your career?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I had a really unique path in that I applied to nursing school straight out of high school, And so there was this new program where they were trying to basically like create fertile environments for nurse researchers. So the idea was that if we applied early, we could be involved in research and then automatically admitted to the nursing program. And so the hope was that we would continue to matriculate into PhD programs. So it worked for me, everything they did. But I remember one of my early nursing professors talked about nursing research in terms of wound care and how when she was in training, wounds were kept as dry as possible. They had like fans and lights and they were always drying them off. And then she learned through research that moist wounds actually heal better. And I remember like I can picture where I was sitting in that lecture and thinking like, "Oh my gosh, like somebody asked this question, gathered
Mhm.
this evidence, and now care is improved." And so I felt like we're going to change the world with nursing research. And parts of me still believe that. I've gotten a little bit less enthusiastic in some respects, but as part of that program, I was involved in some research with foot reflexology and
Hmm.
mindfulness meditation. And so I got to sit with patients and experience them learning these integrative therapies, and then also call them, I think it was weekly, and ask about their symptoms and how the therapies were going. And I also had that experience of like a pretty dry nursing research course where I was like, oh, this is for somebody else. But once I was actually there, like, on the phone with folks and they were telling me, like, "I feel less pain after practicing this," or "I'm feeling a lot
Mm.
less anxious," I realized, like, I can still have interactions with folks. I'm not just, like, in my office with my data all day. And so I can still practice nursing, but through this research lens. So
Mhm.
I also have an older sister who's a nurse, and I saw she was practicing, I think it was just a med surge general
Mhm.
space, and she would share how people would swear at her, people would call her terrible names,
Mhm.
sometimes physical violence,
Mhm.
and so I saw, like, if I move into practice, that's a possibility, and that felt really hard at the time,
Mhm.
and I was
Mhm.
loving my research work, I was feeling really inspired, and so I'm kind of looking at these paths of, like, "Oh, well, I do like practice, but do I really wanna practice in a system that looks and feels like it does?"
Mhm.
So, at that time, I also had a mentor and advisor who was she every day I came in to the office and she was like not every day, but a lot, like, "Have you considered getting a PhD? I think you'd be really good at this." And parts of me were like, "Oh, she's just saying that." But it wore on me over time, and I realized that I do have the capacities and I do have the passion and interest, and that I can still fulfill a lot of my desires to work with patients, work on collaborative teams, and hopefully make a difference to the field.
Could you talk a little bit about that advice, the role of the advisor in graduate schools? Because I think, a lot of times people, when they think of advisors, they think about maybe their college advisors and, you got to make sure you take these classes in order to graduate.
Yeah,
And it's different in graduate school. So,
yeah.
could you talk about your advisor and like what role they had on your influence they had on your own thinking?
Yes, absolutely. So it's quite intimate, at least in my experience. Like I was working hourly on their research. They were directly guiding me through the process of finishing courses and doing my dissertation. So we met really regularly. They were in a role of a nursing professor that I was moving into. So it was like a real wraparound mentorship experience. And I got really lucky. I had two main mentors, and one Dr. Gwen Wyatt. She is a fantastic, rigorous, quantitative, NIH funded, just powerhouse of a researcher. And then my other mentor was Dr. Rebecca Leto, who's also incredible and so creative and full of vision. And we were always drawing pictures and using interesting sticky note techniques. And so it was such a fantastic balance of like we would get these huge ideas of how to change practice and what end of life care could look like. And then we would simultaneously say, like, okay, but what's the timeline look like? How do we actually get this done? So I feel really fortunate for that support.
And now you're in a faculty role yourself.
I am,
Yeah.
yes. Mhm.
So what do you do in that role, in that capacity?
Yes. So the main elements right now include research, teaching, and service. So research is the main part of my time. Teaching is a bit, and service varies, but it's a bit right now. And for my research, I get a lot of say in what I want to do, which is very fortunate. I'm doing some work with spirituality and spiritual care, also some work, and we can unpack this a bit if that feels interesting, but
Yeah.
around perceptions and attitudes about psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy. And then in my teaching role, I teach about nursing research. So it's exciting that those can really come together. And I hope I can like bring a little bit of that passion into the classroom. We'll see how that goes. And then service, I serve on a number of different boards and committees, both in the school, at the university, and then in some psychedelic, interesting organizations as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that was the part I didn't really understand when I got into a faculty role, the service part, when you get voluntold that you're going to be on a committee or something like that. But
Right.
it's also fun stuff. Like, I mean, I helped to gather the people for the Board of Psychedelic Medicine and Therapy.
It's
The
amazing.
so that's service to your profession, right? And so,
Yeah.
but there is a lot of kind of vagueness in academia that I think
Right.
you don't necessarily find out till you get there, what exactly
Right.
this is all about. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, wow, I wish you taught my research methods class. I think I would have probably paid a lot more attention if you had. But I mean, so talk about that, the research that you're doing with regards to psychedelics, and how, if you could maybe connect the dots between like what you're doing and how that might eventually sort of trickle down to what a future psychedelic nurse, whatever that means,
Mhm.
because we're kind of still building that plane as we're flying it. What they might actually do at the bedside. Could you kind of connect those for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I learned about psychedelic assisted therapy, I felt like this is a great intervention for what I'm looking for, which is addressing spirituality and existential suffering. So I did what any new scholar would do and ran a literature search and published a literature review. And I was so enthusiastic about the results, like people feeling less anxious, less depressed, less demoralized, more connected to their spirituality, higher levels of quality of life after moving through these psychedelic assisted therapy protocols.
Mhm.
But what also stood out was that almost everybody across the studies were identified as white, non-Hispanic, and
Mhm.
had relatively high levels of education. So
Mhm.
I recently ran an analysis like demographics across the studies mapped next to demographics of the US, and truly not great in terms of representativeness. So that was one of my main takeaways from that literature review project was like there's a lot of promise here, and there's a lot of people who are not being involved in the research, and maybe their voices and perspectives are not being represented. So that led to the project that I'm currently just starting, and it's a qualitative study specifically to understand perceptions and attitudes about psychedelic assisted therapy among
Mhm.
people who have been underrepresented in research. So
Mhm.
people of color, people with limited educational attainment, and people at
Mhm.
that intersection, meaning they have both of those
Mhm.
experiences. And parts of me just wanted to like run ahead and like do a pilot study or do a trial of psychedelic assisted therapy. But what really stood out was most important was to start to build relationships, start to hear from folks about like, what do you even know about psychedelics? Or what would you want to
Mhm.
know? Or what would maybe make you more or less interested in participating? And
Mhm.
I've worked with the community advisory board along the way. Like they helped me craft the questions for the qualitative interviews. They helped me put together a flyer. They really did not jive with my initial flyer, and it's really sweet to consider like that we can collaborate on building hopefully more inclusive spaces and protocols rather than me just like guessing what would be more inviting.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like sort of taking a notion and really honing it in a way that is actionable, right? Like you can take your findings and turn them into levers to make change, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just being like, well, I think this is what should happen. Like you can say, we've demonstrated that there's this gap here that we have to fill. Um,
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
so in terms of how nurses at the bedside can implement it potentially, like, we are on this journey together. It is totally qualitative, so folks are gonna be telling me what they want and need and think and feel. So I'd be super interested in collaborating and figuring out, like, how do we implement these findings? We haven't done any interviews yet. It was just approved by the IRB, so we're hiring and setting up files and all of that, but I'd be really happy to share once we know more.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the other, like, little known secrets around academia is that a lot of people would love to collaborate if you
Mhm.
reach out to them, right? And you have something that you can offer, or that you want to bring two teams together. I mean, that's one of my favorite things about being a professor is connecting people who might not otherwise know each other, right? And I think you get to do that. I know you and I have collaborated on some writing and things like that, but just finding you kind of find the others, and work on these projects together. Um,
Yes. Mm.
so what are some of the are there any it sounds like you're just kind of getting started on this inquiry, but are there
Mhm.
any kind of things that you're finding out about this really important question about how do we increase equity and access in this space? Like, how do we get people these things?
Yeah.
That it seems there's a lot of good intentions in the space, but it doesn't always seem to kind of square with what people actually want,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
need. So could you share your thoughts on that?
Yes. So these are all my, like, best educated guesses from the
Sure.
literature. No interviews have been done, but I feel like there's some elements of just, like, the usual underrepresentation in research, like past abuses, current potential for power dynamics in research, like people who are marginalized are less likely to participate for just the normal reasons around research. But then there's also this interesting element of, like, the war on drugs and stigma around drugs that is really targeted people of color. So the idea that they might want to, like, come into a therapy space and give me their phone and their keys and have this pretty intense power dynamic present. I think with psychedelic assisted therapy, there's an extra level of care and intention needed.
Hmm.
And then there's also some interesting research on how, like, the people who are actually introducing the studies, like me as a research nurse potentially, or someone, say, in the cancer center in the context of my studies, might actually be less likely to approach patients with marginalized identities or folks that they think might say no to the study. So they don't even approach. So
Hmm.
there's all of these interesting elements that are present that I'm grateful and excited for the opportunity to get to tease them out a little bit further. So I'm looking to other research in health equity, but then also we're in a new exciting space with psychedelic assisted therapy. And I know Nicole Buchanan and Monica Williams and some incredible scholars have been writing about this. So I'm not to say that I'm the first or the only, but grateful to get to chip away at some issues here in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like there's an opportunity there for nurses specifically, because our profession can be a little more diverse, and sometimes we're seen as sort of the people. Is there an opportunity there to
Mhm.
kind of translate this, or to communities that might otherwise, kind of think that's not for me?
Yeah, I think so, and I hope so. I mean, we know nurses are well trusted. We're pretty good at building relationships and being genuine. When I showed up to my community advisory board meeting, they said, like, I can feel how much you care about this. And like that makes me care about it. And so I think, yeah, nurses, we've got some special energy around our care and presence.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of that sort of translational capacity that we tend to have. I mean, you have a patient who's going through some complex medical treatment, and you have a patient's family who might have a very limited education or medical literacy, and we find the language to explain this,
Mm.
so that people can understand and be part of their care, right? um,
Yes, yes. I'm thinking of, like, for the current study, we our initial draft of our consent form was, like, 14 pages long, and I realized, like, we're trying to recruit folks with limited educational attainment, and we're gonna give them this like book of consent. So how do we balance accessibility with also providing the information that folks need? So that's an interesting dance that I'm engaging in.
Right, because you don't want to oversimplify it because then you lose details. But then if it's too dense, it's like it's like who reads the terms and conditions when you install software, right? You go to the end and say, I agree. I have no idea what I just agreed to, but
Wait, you don't read those?
only if I have really bad insomnia. Yeah. Yeah. And your work, I mean, a lot of what you're interested in is, as I was remembering back, I think it was during the pandemic. I don't know if who reached out to you. You might have reached out to me, but we had a conversation about your Death Café project, and like a lot of, I remember being really kind of struck by that because it was, I'd love to hear, I'm sure the audience would love to hear more about what is a Death Café.
Yes. Oh, I love it. This is one of my favorite things. So I did not invent Death Cafe. I'm fortunate to carry forward, excuse me, a model that existed before I found it. Take a sip of water.
Yes.
So Death Cafe was founded by someone named John Underwood. And he said basically we can have these spaces where basically they're safe spaces, safe enough spaces where we can talk about death, dying, and grief. And they're super unstructured. And so anyone who follows the principles that he has laid out can call themselves a death cafe, which I really love. It's so accessible and welcoming, and truly anybody can do this. So I've been hosting one with a dear friend, Andy Earl, for the last, oh my gosh, maybe 5, 6 years now. And our intention is to increase awareness of mortality so that we can make the most of our lives while we're still here. And so we gather up, we share like what brought us to the cafe. And then it's at least the one that I space hold for, it's a lot of silence with shares kind of coming up from there. So when someone feels called to share a story, a question, a thought, anything at all. So sometimes it's super practical, like I read this book, or I learned about this new human composting technique. And so we all are like taking notes and trying to track websites. And other times it's like, I'm facing this big health issue, or I lost a child. And so we're all exploring and holding that together. And it truly feels psychedelic in a lot of ways. Like we go in and we don't know necessarily who's going to be there and what topics are going to be brought up and what feelings are going to be present. And then we all move through the 90 minutes or so together. And then we have a bit of a checkout, like, what are you taking away? What are you feeling now after moving through this cafe experience? And it feels like sometimes it really hits and it really works. And sometimes I'm like having a really hard time sticking with it for those 90 minutes. But I do feel like overall it helps me reorient again and again to like, what do I actually care about? What do I actually want to focus on? What's most important to me? Kind of little micro doses of that every couple weeks, which is how often we host.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that Stoic practice of memento mori. The remember you will die, as a way of kind of being more alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am curious how you see the parallels between this practice and psychedelics in palliative care, because that is a place where they seem to be getting a fair amount of traction. Where what sort of overlaps do you see between those two practices?
Yeah. Oh, that was such a great question. I'm going to take a minute to feel
Yeah.
it. Yeah. So we see that folks often come through their psychedelic experiences and talk about relating with mortality, maybe for the first time, maybe in more spacious ways or more meaningful ways. And then we often see folks sharing like, oh, how do I actually want to live? Like I've been spending my energy on all these things that don't actually matter. or don't matter in my deepest integrity. So often reorienting to what is most important.
Mhm.
And I've seen and heard of folks having those experiences right near the end of their lives, like really reorienting to what how they really want to be in the world. And so we all get to where we need to get at our own pace, I believe. But I do think these practices around remembering death and practices with psychedelics, I hope can help us reflect on how we want to spend this limited time we have while we're here.
Yeah. What do you think of that idea that psychedelics, particularly things like psilocybin, are kind of an opportunity to rehearse death?
Mm,
You know, people talk about ego death, but they also talk about, really feel, particularly with things like 5-MeO DMT. People talk about this sort of feeling of like atomization of like, is this what death is like? Any thoughts on that?
yeah, it's a great question. I always want to stay humble. As far as I know, in this moment, I haven't gone to the other side and come back yet. So I, I speak with the most humility and curiosity. But folks' accounts in terms of near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences, especially with DMT and then in 5-MeO, are very similar. And also, after going through psychedelic-assisted therapy experiences, folks report less death anxiety. So I feel like if we can do some reps and practice letting go and practice being okay with discomfort, that's got to help, right? I hope. I hope.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned also the question of grief too, and how does that, how do you feel like that shows up in these kind
Mm,
of palliative psychedelic applications? Is there
yeah.
anything we can learn from that?
Mm, yeah. That is a space that I am very interested in seeing more research around. I've worked with Dr. Paul Hudson here at UW to start to dream up a protocol of psychedelic-assisted therapy for complicated grief, and it feels a little bit tricky because grief isn't, as far as I know, like a DSM diagnosis. So we're wondering, how do we, like, identify folks who have grief in a way where they could use this particular support? I feel like there's a lot of possibility there. Mhm.
Yeah, that was a big controversy when they came out with DSM-5 because there
Mhm.
was what they called the grief exception and major depressive diagnosis that like if you've recently had a major loss, you couldn't be diagnosed with depression.
Mhm.
If I mean, you could have depression before, but if
Mhm.
if you started to exhibit symptoms of depression following a loss, you wouldn't be diagnosed with depression. And then there was this big controversy about whether they should keep that or take that out, because on the one side they said, well, if you take that out, then people with depression are going to slip through and they're not going to get treated and they'll get worse. And then, a whole raft of people saying, well, you're pathologizing like the most normal of human experiences,
Yeah.
right? And like grief is not pathological usually, right? But if it goes on for protracted period of time, and then like, what's a normal amount of time to grieve? Like, what's a reason? I mean, my teachers around grief said, grief is cyclical. You never really finish grieving, and that's okay. You know, Hopefully it
Mhm.
becomes less focused. But so so you imagine possibly research where you would use a psychedelic intervention to help people with grief? Is that something that I think I heard you say?
Yeah, I do think so. I would be really interested in, and maybe it's me, maybe it's someone else exploring that space. It feels like that could potentially be really helpful in a area where I don't think there's that much to offer. I mean, being in support groups and being in death cafes and going through grief together, I think there's so much magic and help in that. But we don't really, maybe you know of some that I don't, but have much structured support for grief or stuff that we can offer to help folks move
Mhm.
through that space or integrate that. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and if they have a kind of a mystical experience in that, does that if they kind of encounter a lost loved one in a psychedelic space, does that provide comfort or is that distressing? I mean, those are all open questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like consent in this area is so incredibly tricky. Like,
Mm,
how do we, uh, grief is never necessarily done. So
no.
how can we build that framework with folks? Like, what's actually potentially going to unfold?
Yeah. Yeah. And the way that grief, has this kind of mycelial connection to other grief,
Mm,
and that when you have a new grief, it kind of causes resonant frequency to previous grief, that may or may not be fully resolved, but it's kind of reconstituted in that moment, um, which
yeah.
is totally normal. We don't, you know. Yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah, I worked on a study of people with depression and Parkinson's disease, because like half of people with depression or half of people with Parkinson's get depression, which isn't
Mm,
surprising. It's kind of a rotten disease. Um, but what was really interesting to me being a facilitator on that was how many people talked about the loss of previous abilities they had, physical. I had a guy who would like go boating every day of the year almost, and he couldn't do that. And, used to do like hard physical labor and couldn't do that anymore. And even though he wasn't actively dying, these sort of parts of him had dropped off as a result of the disease. And, I think we see this in lots of disease states as people lose their abilities. Do you think there's something that's unique to psychedelics that allows for that process to be moved through in a way that maybe conventional psychotherapy
mm,
doesn't or is limited in? I'm just curious if
yeah.
there's what's the added bonus, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I wonder, in my experience, grief can be pretty like sticky in my body. And so grief from experiences when I was a child, maybe I felt like we're resolved or all done. And then years later, I felt like, wow, that's really still in there. And I've had an opportunity to process and express that grief in new ways. And so I wonder about the process of psychedelic assisted therapy as helping us feel and express things that
Mm,
maybe we wouldn't otherwise have access to feel and
mm,
express. And I recognize there are so many options like yoga and breath work and TRE exercises. And I think for some of us, psychedelic assisted therapy or psychedelics in other contexts can maybe help be a catalyst to do
mhm.
that feeling and expressing that grief is, oh, so sticky, it's so hard. A friend has a podcast called "Grief is a Sneaky Bitch," and I think of that often. Like, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking about your initiation into grief too, and how fortunate were you to have a mother who was open, who invited more questions and conversation rather than, I think so many of us kind of got the, grandma's sleeping or, she's not going to wake up anymore, and that was kind of the end of the conversation, and
Mhm.
so to have that initiation as a child into curiosity and
Yeah,
inquiry around grief rather than sort of what most of us got, which is hope it goes away quickly, and then
yes.
wonder what's wrong with us when it doesn't, right?
Mm, yeah.
Yeah. There's also something about grief too in community that seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, this Western thing where we sort of grieve and, I mean, I had a job once where I think you got 3 days off for bereavement leave.
Mm,
It's like go bury mom and come back to work. I mean,
oh my gosh.
setting aside all the critiques of capitalism that invites, but just this, but the idea too that like you grieve alone, and I think about certain traditions like Shiva, in the Jewish tradition where everyone comes over and brings food, and you're not alone in your grief, and since psychedelics are so often done in community, it seems like there's kind of a natural kinship there.
Yes. Yes. Oh, I value that so much. Grief and community. It feels sometimes like so isolating. Like it's
Yeah.
just nobody else feels this way. And then
Yeah.
finding out that maybe other folks feel similarly. I often leave the death cafes with this sense of like we're linked arm in arm and we're walking toward this thing that nobody really knows what it is and it's super mysterious and sometimes scary, but like at least we're doing it together, which is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I want to
Mhm.
hear more about the work that you're doing with the center at UW-Madison with
Yeah.
I think it's a psychoactive. The full name is escaping me right now, but the Center for
Mouthful. Yeah.
Center for where is it here? It's in your bio. Um, yeah, the Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances at
Yes.
UW-Madison. Tell us more about that. What are you actually doing there?
Yes. So it's a wonderful group of folks from across campus, across so many different areas. And the essence is that we have space to gather up and create events, create collaborations, create community relationships and content. And we're actually really in a pretty early space to figure out like what actually is the center. Like right now it's probably about 10 of us who like get on Zoom sometimes and occasionally share meals and we're the center. But we've also had some strategic planning around like what does that actually mean and why are we doing this? So it's in a really a hopeful place, I think an exciting place um, to see what we can be. So we've got some folks from pharmacy directed by Dr. Paul Hudson. He really leads the center. And then we've
Hmm.
got some folks in medicine and neuroscience and social work and Latin American studies and history and such a fantastic mix of perspectives. Some of our main what I'm most involved in right now is organizing the upcoming UW-Madison Psychedelic Symposium, which you know about, you'll be speaking there. But a lot of our efforts are into organizing this event right now, and it happens yearly every time we have different like themes or topics. So this year is focused on equity and access, relational psychedelic assisted therapy. So like what's really happening in relationship during sessions and a mechanistic inquiry. So similarly, like what's happening? How do these things work? And so we're bringing in
Hmm.
what I think are some fantastic speakers. I've been co-chairing the organizing of that, and I think it's a great way to get folks in a room together, get us in the same space, and learn together, build some relationships. Mhm.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be a small part of that. Um, I think people that haven't put conferences together have no idea how much work is involved in doing them as you're probably getting a crash course and finding out, right?
Oh, that mysterious service line, I'll tell you, new things just keep popping up, and, like, this was something, like, I knew, I was like, "This is gonna be a big lift," but it's something I really care about, and it's growing, and it is a big lift, but I feel so fortunate to get to be a part of it. Mhm.
Yeah, and I love the idea that you're kind of, I mean, kind of like a psychedelic experience. Like you set your intention. This is what we think we'd like it to look like, but it's not scripted.
Yeah.
Like you don't know what kind of conversations are going to come out of it, or what disagreements there might be, or conflicts. And that's actually what makes it kind of interesting.
Yes.
Sometimes conferences can be kind of boring, honestly. They're a little bit scripted, right? But I don't, this won't be. I know that much. So for
Yeah.
people that are interested or want to play in or are in the Madison area, when is it? And feel free to give us a little plug here.
Yeah, it is November, I believe, 7th and 8th. It's a Thursday and Friday. And if you just search UW-Madison Psychedelic Symposium, that will should come up for you. Come to Madison. I love it here. I think it's so sweet. So I'd be happy to have anybody to join. And I felt like I was going to say something else, but I can't think of it right now. Oh, parts of me almost said no to organizing because I wanted it to be so perfect and I wanted to be able to curate everything and have like the best symposium ever. So it's been a huge learning process for me to embrace what you just shared. Like it's going to unfold, how it's going to unfold, and
Mhm.
I look forward to that.
Yeah, and we've got the website there. It's one of
Great.
those long URLs, but we can also put that in the on the YouTube comments so that people can find and click on that easily. Um, so it's a couple days. It sounds like it's multidisciplinary. There's going to be
Yeah.
different types of speakers there. So obviously there'll be some nurses there because you and I will be there. Will there be
Yeah.
will there be other nurse speakers? Do you know at this point?
Goodness. Other nurse speakers. I do not believe so, but we have a really, what I think is exciting focus on equity and access. So we're bringing in various folks to talk about like what their decrim process looks like, and also someone who's talking about underground psychedelic use for cluster headaches. So
Mm,
folks who are like creating these, what I think are really interesting and important routes to access that aren't just the medical models. So I think nurses have a lot to offer both in the medicalized space and in these interesting other spaces that are being created. And obviously underground work has existed.
right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I mean, this is the challenge that we're facing now, right? Is that, post the FDA decision around MDMA, it's kind of sent a lot of people sort of back to the drawing board for a little while. And,
Yes.
how do people access these things in an equitable way that doesn't involve, necessarily paying $4,000 to a underground facilitator?
Right.
Because that's not really equitable either, right? If it's only for people that have large amounts of cash available.
Right.
Um,
I don't at all like mean to necessarily endorse seeking underground care. There's a lot of complexity there, but I do want to highlight like we have a local Madison Psychedelic Society that has meetups regularly and integration circles regularly, and pretty much anybody can come and say like, "Hey, I have an idea for an event. Can I host this?" So I bet a lot of nurses who might be listening to this have a local psychedelic society and have ways to organize and get involved if it isn't like being a facilitator on a trial because there's only so many spaces. But community work can take us really far, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, it also gets me thinking about like, the early days of, I'm in San Francisco, which was ground zero for the early AIDS crisis, right? And how nurses were really kind of, underground sounds like kind of a strange term in that context, but for example, like discovering that the cannabis improved people's appetites so that uh, they didn't lose much weight and didn't get as cachectic, and that this sort of sharing of knowledge and technology um, was a core function of nursing
Mhm,
um, in these times when there isn't like a clear answer yet.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, that's so. I think we've got a few questions that are rolling in. I think Wendy will queue those up on the back end for us here. But if you do have questions and you want to put them into your into the question box, you can certainly do that here. Um, there's a question here. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, here we go. Oh, hi, Laura. Nice to see you on here. Hi, Dr. Miller. So thrilled to hear you talk tonight. Briefly worked in hospice, and I'm interested in becoming a palliative care nurse. Do you have any advice on how to get there?
fantastic. So some of my start was to volunteer in a local hospice. So it had some training and some orientation. And then I got the chance to just spend some time in the hospice, getting to know the folks there. Sometimes it was really logistical, like helping in the kitchen, and sometimes it was really relational, like reading with folks or just having conversations. So I think there's a lot of space to just potentially start moving into hospice and palliative care. And if there's a local palliative care center or organization, I bet they'd be really glad to hear from you and to hear your interests.
Yeah, there's no substitute for experience, right?
Mm,
Just starting to do the thing.
yeah.
Um, and sometimes people start doing it and they find out they don't really like it, right? You know,
Mm, it's
which
great
which
information. Yeah.
which is good to know too, right? Um, There's a question here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight it. Um, so what's the situation with the MAID program for people not familiar, this is the medical aid in dying, um, which perhaps you could flesh that out for us a little bit. Are they on board with using psychedelics in conjunction with the dying?
Oh, that
Thanks,
is a
Kevin, for that.
fantastic question, Kevin. That is fantastic. So, what MAID or medical aid in dying is, for folks who might not know, is that there are some places or programs where folks can either go to a center or in their own homes receive substances or administer themselves substances that would end their lives in what's believed to be a dignified and comfortable way. And there's a lot of potential controversies here. It's not available everywhere, but some places it is. And gosh, are they on board? So I think there's a lot of folks who are the they in this. I bet there are a lot of people who are involved in MAID programs who would be excited to see psychedelics used in conjunction. I bet there are some folks who wouldn't be as on board with that, but I have seen some really fantastic writings about like basically building a case that if folks can access medical aid in dying, but they can't access psychedelic assisted therapy, that seems really backwards. Like we could at least have this stop, which is psychedelic assisted therapy. And if they go through this process and they still want to go through with MAID, that could potentially be supported. I also recently read something about someone building a case for like if a patient wants to access MAID and then they go through psychedelic assisted therapy and they change their mind, how do we grapple with that? And I think that's a super complex space to exist within that I don't think there has been much, I don't know, like right answers or necessarily research in this area, but a lot of interesting space for trying to figure out what to do with these things. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, we have MAID in California, and it's an interesting question, right? Because if people
Mhm.
are seeking assistance in dying
Mhm.
because they're suffering from sort of existential distress, does it would it make sense to offer a psychedelic therapy
Mhm.
experience first, before you decide that's how you want to resolve the suffering, right? Might there be something in that psychedelic experience that makes that suffering more tolerable? I think
Yeah.
that's the question, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about this in this paper that you and I are working on, in
Mhm.
reviewing that, because I mean, talk about a good research question, right? You
Yeah.
know, if you could, what, how would you structure that? You're the researcher. Tell me, like, how would
Yeah.
you set something up like that to answer that question?
Right, right. Like if folks who access psychedelic assisted therapy, are they maybe more or less likely to move on to MAID? But I also want to offer a really interesting, what I think is interesting, additional wrench into this question is that a lot of folks, and some amazing palliative care scholars keep reminding me of this, a lot of folks don't have access to just basic psychosocial spiritual care.
Right.
A lot of folks, or maybe not a lot, I've heard of a few folks wanting to access MAID because they can't pay for their health care.
Oh,
So, like, psychedelics aren't going to help with that. There's a lot of systemic issues like access to care and just basic levels of support that I think we can't forget about.
yeah, for sure. And then the qualitative piece that you kind of alluded to earlier is so important. And one of my mentors, Maria Mangini, always says, nursing is a storytelling profession. Like
Mhm,
and that's not a dig at all. I mean, when you think about like what
mhm.
is rounds in a hospital, like when we do change a shift, right? We tell each other the story of the patient, and there's a narrative, there's data in there, there's quantitative pieces, but there's also like, oh, their family is there, the daughter just got here from Nantucket, she brought brownies for everyone, like that's qualitative, right?
Yeah.
um and so like I think nursing really
Mhm.
values that, right? Like, so we
Yeah.
could look at how many people the intervention changes their course, but we could also like, what's the story, why did it change their course?
Yeah.
um
Mm. feels really exciting. Yeah.
It does, yeah. And that, maybe choosing MAID isn't a failure, right? It's like,
Right.
because that would be the other thing you wouldn't want to set up is create a situation where it feels like, oh,
Mm.
if you do a psychedelic experience and you still go through with MAID, it didn't work, right?
Right. Oh, yeah, that's a huge choice no matter what, and sometimes a one that's best for somebody, I imagine.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to ask you to put your advisor hat on here for this one. So, what are some examples of good nursing experience to have as a new grad if you have an interest in participating in research in psychoactive substances and or
Mm,
psychedelic nursing? Like, so if you're a student watching this, you're a nursing student, what should you
mm,
be thinking about doing if you want to kind of position yourself to be able
mm.
to work in this field at some point down the road?
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear that you're interested. Definitely, I would encourage you to keep going there. And for me, joining my local psychedelic society and getting involved in the community, getting to know folks that way has been really foundational for moving my career in this direction. So I would start a search for local folks nearby who might be hosting events or offering opportunities to be involved. A lot of those events, at least in my experience, look like folks coming and asking questions like, I don't know anything about psychedelics. So you could potentially start information sharing, relationship building in those spaces. There's so many structured training programs available. So that's also a good place to search, like where to get some training in psychedelic assisted therapy. Because there are so many, there are varying levels of quality and usefulness. So I would seek out some folks who maybe know about those programs if that's possible, or reach out if that feels useful.
Do you think that there's clinical, sometimes in nursing school you get a little bit of say in like what kind of clinical settings you're in for your rotations. Do you think there's particular kind of clinical experiences that would be more
Mm,
useful for a future psychedelic nurse?
yes. Oh, that's a really good question. So I might be biased, but I think palliative and end of life care is in fantastic space for that. So we practice like holding space for folks in this non-ordinary experience that is dying. And we also practice being with suffering that we can't fix, which is
Mhm.
such a valuable skill that is not easy, I think, for a lot of us. And then maybe similarly in the beginning of life, in birth care, that some similar skills can be flexed. So yeah, I think those could both be really good avenues. And I wish there were more opportunities to have nursing students or new grads have clinical experiences in psychedelic assisted therapy. At least in my university, that isn't currently the case. Like, I've finished all of the didactic content of the MAPS training, but I need to have a mentored experience to like say that I am done. And there just are not mentored experiences currently available. So there's a really tricky bottleneck that I hope we can get past to give folks more hands-on experience.
Yeah. Shameless plug. Sandy Sandberg and I just wrote something on my Substack proposing an idea that nurses really be the people that are central to the care, to the actual dosing session. That like it's a nurse and a trainee who could be another nurse, could be a psychology trainee, a physician trainee, whatever, who actually are with the patient the entire time during the session, and that therapists do the pre and the post work, but really it's during psychedelic sessions that that patients really need care more than therapy, and nurses
Uh,
are the best folks to be doing that. So maybe
mm,
we'll attach that in here too.
yeah. Have you ever been interviewed on this space, Andrew? I would love to ask and hear your responses about that.
Yeah, a while back when we didn't have as many guests to interview, we all took turns at filling in the empty months. So thanks,
Yes,
Wendy's.
I would
But
love to see you and Sandy share about that work.
yeah, we had Sandy on a few months ago too. So if people want to go
Mhm.
back in the archives and see her work, she does some really amazing work in sort of program development and philanthropy and really some thought leadership around this stuff. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here, and we always wrap up these questions with kind of a traditional question, which is kind of a fun one. If you could go back, looking back over your career now, which is really picking up speed. I've been, I feel like I've gotten to know you as you've been really picking up speed in the last few years. And you could give your younger self a little bit of advice. Is there anything that you would tell the younger Meg?
Yeah, let's see. Thanks for asking. I had a sense this question was coming, and I didn't want to overthink it or necessarily have something ready. So this season in life is a lot about community and building relationships and collaborations and feeling like I don't have to be the one to fix things, but we're doing it together, which is amazing. So I'll give myself some advice that we get to do it together, and I think it's better in community. It's better together.
Yeah, what a gift. Yeah, we do have that's one of the things that having this organization, being part of this organization, has really taught me. We have there's 2,800 people that get our newsletters. There's a lot of, who was it Terrence McKenna said, find the others. This is a place to find the others for sure, and to not have to do it all ourselves, which is it's probably its biggest value, honestly. Meg, it's really, the time has gone by so fast that I can't believe we're already at an hour here, but I really appreciate you taking part of your evening and chatting with our audience. And this, of course, will go up on our YouTube archive as soon as we're done here. So if you didn't get a chance to get off work and you want to watch this on your own time or send it to a friend, you can certainly do that by going to the Open Nurses YouTube channel. But really appreciate all the work you're doing, and I'm excited that you're just at the beginning of your career, because I can tell you're going to do some phenomenal things in the years ahead, and we can say we knew you when.
Oh, thanks, Andrew, for the invite and all your work with Open Nurses and the other folks too. It's been a real solid place to be in this field. Thanks.
I'm glad it feels that way. That's great. And and I will see you in November for that conference. I'm looking forward to going to Madison. So I've actually never been to Madison before, so I'm looking forward to seeing Madison in the fall. I hear it's a beautiful place, so look forward to seeing it. Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here tonight, and we will see you next month. Keep an eye on your email inboxes for announcements for the next Open Nurses Psychedelic Chat. Thanks for being here. Have a good night. Bye, y'all.